Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to the annual Wolfe Lecture on the Holocaust, presented this year by guest speaker Barry Trachtenberg, with Yiddish poetry reading by Elly Gotz. I'm Doris Bergen, the Chancellor Rose and Ray Wolfe Professor of Holocaust Studies here at the University of Toronto, and it is my great pleasure to host this event today. I want to start with the land acknowledgement, and I want to say a few words about its particular significance for our topic. Professor Trachtenberg's description of his lecture on the Yiddish Encyclopedia promises, quote, a story about destruction and trauma, but also one of tenacity and continuity. Thinking about those words, destruction and tenacity, I also was thinking about the news from the past almost 2 years now, confirming unmarked graves at the sites of residential schools for Indigenous children in various parts of Canada, including last month, the discovery of the jawbone of a 4 to 6 year old child in Lebret, Saskatchewan. Thinking about that news also reminded me of the writing of Hermann Kruk, the Jewish Bundist leader who was a librarian in the Vilna ghetto, who kept a meticulous diary which survived the Holocaust, though he did not. In his diary, Hermann Kruk wrote, quote, over the graves of murdered children, poison flowers grow. In the spirit of recognizing what Nate Leipziger has referred to as the commonalities in the shared Indigenous Jewish histories of devastation and survival, in the spirit of recognizing the persistence of life, I wish to acknowledge this land on which the University of Toronto operates. For thousands of years, it's been the traditional land of the Huron-Wendat, the Seneca, and the Mississaugas of the Credit. Today, this meeting place is still home to many Indigenous people from across Turtle Island, and we are grateful to have the opportunity to work on this land. I also want to express deep gratitude to Elizabeth Wolfe, who's with us today, for her generous and enduring support of Holocaust studies at the University of Toronto. I'm so grateful to your late mother, Chancellor Rose Wolfe, for establishing the chair that I hold, and I deeply appreciate the many opportunities it creates for teaching and research. I also want to note the absence here today of Michael Maris, the inaugural holder of the Wolfe Chair. My friend and colleague, Michael died in December, and this is the first Wolfe lecture ever without him, and we remember him today. Thanks also to the Elizabeth and Tony Comper Holocaust Education Fund for support. And of course, huge thanks to the Anne Tannenbaum Center for Jewish Studies, our director, Anna Sternches, here with us, Galina, Natasha, Constance, all of you are brilliant and your efforts have been essential to this event. I want to thank the Faculty of Arts and Science, Diana Tishko, who made the beautiful poster for us that you see, and also the Azrieli Foundation and the University of Toronto Bookstore for making the books available. Thanks to Dr. Yu Wong for assistance on this event, and to our work study students, Vanessa, Isaac, Sally, Odell, Lysander, and Tal. We appreciate all of your efforts. I have to add a special, really emphatic word of thanks to Eli Yani, PhD student in Yiddish and special assistant to the Wolfe Chair. Eli's beautiful translations of the poems from Yiddish to English on the insert are only the most obvious of his many contributions. And Eli, I know you're there on Zoom. We could not have done this event without you. Thanks, of course, to Barry Trachtenberg and Elly Gotz for being with us. Now, I want to say a word about books. Our event is about books, or more specifically, the relationship between books and people. And I want to mention that we have 2 books available here today. Barry Trachtenberg's book, The Holocaust and the Exile of Yiddish. Fantastic cover also, is for sale from the table outside. And for those of you joining us online, Eli will drop into the chat information on how you can order a copy of the book from the University of Toronto bookstore. We also are really grateful to have Elly Gotz's memoir, Flights of Spirit, here, free, courtesy of the Israeli Foundation. And also, those of you online, if you would like a copy of the book by PDF, we can send that to you. Just make a note in the chat. Eli Yani will take note if you note his email address, and we'll make sure that you receive a PDF. So everyone who wants Flights of Spirit, absolutely, it's yours. Now I want to turn to the poetry reading in Yiddish by Elly Gotz. Those of you in the room, you'll find the original Yiddish of the poems and the English translations by Eli Yani, plus biographies of the two poets on the insert. If you're joining us online, Eli will put a link in the chat where you can access so you can follow along, whether you know Yiddish or not, you can follow along. And that material is also available on the website of the Center for Jewish Studies. While you're pulling that up, I want to tell you why we created the program this way. So Professor Trachtenberg's book ends with this sentence about the Algemeyne Encyclopedia. Quote, taken as a whole, it is an unrivaled depiction of how Yiddish cultural and intellectual activists tenaciously responded to the hopes, traumas, and triumphs of the middle decades of the 20th century, when they went from achieving their greatest accomplishments to suffering their most profound losses, and then sought to chart a new path forward into the future. Thinking about that passage made me think about the amazing Yiddish program that we have here at the University of Toronto. Thanks to Anna Sternschus, our fabulous PhD students. By the way, there's a lecture tomorrow featuring Tova Benjamin in Yiddish. But I was also thinking about how rarely we hear Yiddish in events on the Holocaust. How rarely we hear Yiddish as a living language when talking about the Holocaust. I also realized that we have in our community friends for whom Yiddish is the mother tongue, going back to before the Shoah. And of course, notably, Elly Gotz, survivor from Lithuania, author, engineer, renowned speaker, and a lifelong fan of Yiddish poetry. So we decided to invite Elly to choose some poems in Yiddish, to read them, to frame Barry's presentation on the Holocaust and the exile of Yiddish. And so please join me in welcoming to the podium Mr. Elly Gotz.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy to be here. I don't often get a chance to read Yiddish in public. But before I start, I want to tell Professor Trachtenberg that we had in our library in Kovno, my father had several volumes of the Encyclopedia. And I remember clearly dipping into them in the ghetto because we brought all the books to the ghetto, especially in the two volumes called Yidden, Jews. There were two separate volumes, right? And I remember vaguely that they were printed in Berlin. Am I wrong in that?
Paris.
In Paris, okay. My father had these and I used to look into them. And I have here two books, both of which I found in the wonderful Yiddish library collection of books in, where is it? In Anders. And I had these books at home in Kovno, and I used to read. I knew half this book by heart, and I loved it. And now I will read one poem by Rivke Galin called Erget's White. I'm keeping the book just to make sure I don't make a mistake. I know it by heart. Geht weiter hinter Chine, ist Farana Samedine. Man darf nicht arbeiten, nicht sklaven. Kinder leben wie die Grafen. Nicht kein Lehrer, nicht kein Klassen. Kann man hulen in die Gassen. Man darf nicht kammen sich, nicht waschen. Schokolade kann man naschen. Betten seien alle dorten ausgemacht von süßen Torten. Darfst dem Zingel noch euch strecken, kannst du Zuckerleckers lecken. Als du willst, kannst du sich liegen, naschen Torten, Chappen fliegen. Willst du, springst du auf das Stellje. Willst du, spielst du in Kapelle. Singen dorten alle Fischen. Kinder tanzen auf die Tischen. Jeder lebt sich wie ein Melach. Es kennt sich lebendig und freilich. Wenn ich weiß den Weg in China, wollte ich suchen die Medine. Es kann sich sein ein bisschen liegen, aber gut, erfahren liegen. Thank you. The other one is a very favorite of mine, Eliezer Steinberg. He was a great writer. He wrote this one book. He lived in Romania, and I don't know if he wrote much else, but he's well known for the wonderful book. In Lithuania, we used to get a visit by Mr. Grossbart. Grossbart was a wonderful reader of literature, Shalom Aleichem, and he used to read a lot of these. And I clearly remember attending as a 13-year-old when Grossbart read this poem, this moshel, Das Pferd und die Peitsch. Oi, so schön kommen am Apolle auf der Pfeitelballe Golle, dein Balleboss dem Schänen, und auf dir mit ihm in einem, sagt zu der Peitsch, sagt das Pferd. Steitsch, sich also ins gehört, sagt, was kommt aus mir, sich zu schlagen? Meinst mir, bringt zu schleppen oder den Bogen? Nun, das vergessen, als zum allerersten, muss ich mal, ich nehme Chotschak Gersten, und verwas nicht hat gehoben. Aber, geh reit zu a Kidjele agroba. Wollt dich noch wie nicht gestochen, wollst du aufgehört, so zu fochen, Kateven und Schinden passen. Wieder, ihr gewaltvoll schreien über alle Gassen. Schweig, knackt die Beitsch mit schmeißendiger Zunge. Emes, sagt sie, schleppen also Wogen und dazu noch auf den hungrigen Morgen. Heißt nur ja, a Reusung von dir die Lung. Nur dich schlag ich, Herr, bis so dir sag ich, nicht auf was willst nicht schleppen, nur Beheime nicht verstanden und gelost sich spannen.
Thank you so much, Elly, for those really beautiful readings. Now I have another special pleasure, which is to introduce Barry Trachtenberg. Barry Trachtenberg is the Rubin Presidential Chair of Jewish History at Wake Forest University in North Carolina. He's the author of 3 books, the one that we've been talking about, The Holocaust and the Exile of Yiddish, and also the United States and the Nazi Holocaust, Race, Refuge, and Remembrance, and his first book, The Revolutionary Roots of Modern Yiddish, 1903 to 1917. Professor Trachtenberg's scholarship is very publicly engaged. He serves on the board of Facing History and Ourselves, and is a member of the Academic Advisory Board of Jewish Voice for Peace. I have to also add on a personal note that Barry was my first ever master's student more than 30 years ago at the University of Vermont. He went on to bigger and better things like Oxford and UCLA, but I'm so proud to have been a small part of your formation. So Barry, I'm delighted that you're here, and please join me in welcoming Professor Barry Trachtenberg.
Thank you so much. I'm so thrilled to be here. I'm really quite grateful, and I have many thank yous. I'd also like to begin with to Anna Sternsis, and we were just talking that over 20 years ago now, 4 years ago.
I think 30.
Yeah. we were students together in an international institute for students on Yiddish in Jerusalem and Tel Aviv. I would like to thank Eli Janney, Constant Chan, Lena Weissman, Dr. Yu Wang, Elly Gotz for those amazing poems, and really most of all to Doris. I really can't thank you enough. I'll say that in the 30 years since I was sort of formally your student, I've had many other professors and teachers, but none of them have had the level of influence on my scholarship, on my life, on my thinking that you had when I was really quite young and just getting started. And I'm so grateful for that. I'm so grateful to have had this continuing relationship with you all of this time. It's really been one of the great treasures of my life. And I'm still nervous giving a talk in front of you. I will say, I even put in my notes, if you're nervous, it's okay to say so. So my research on the Algemeyne Encyclopedia was to have been a one-off journal one-off essay in a journal volume that was dedicated to Jewish encyclopedias. I was invited to write this in 2006. So some projects take a long time to come to fruition. But really soon after I began, I found that the story of the Algemeyne Encyclopedia was so compelling and seemingly utterly unknown by contemporary scholars that I just knew that it had to be told. And there's many reasons why it took so long, but I actually, and I hope it was worth it, but the duration of working on this project actually allowed for all sorts of opportunities to research it that would not have been possible had I just kind of pushed through when I first came to sit down and read the encyclopedia. So what I came to understand was that the history of this encyclopedia was a way to chart the displacement of Yiddish and its many attached political and cultural ideologies away from its geographical center in Eastern Europe towards what became an increasingly dispersed and transnational community of Yiddish speakers, and a community, of course, that ultimately lacked a center on account of the Holocaust. And for me, what makes this work stand out so much is that it's one of the very, very few threads of continuity that stretches across the enormously profound abyss that is the Holocaust. There's so very few cultural projects that began in Europe before the war and that were successfully able to continue through the war and the Holocaust and continue in the decades afterwards. When we look so often at histories of this period, they either start or they sort of end in 1939 or they started in 1945. But this project continues through. And so it's a way to think about the middle decades of the 20th century as a whole, as opposed to just simply in terms of rupture. So although few people today ever think to consult a physical encyclopedia, let alone purchase an actual set, I know it's laughable now, right? And what our notion of an encyclopedia comprises is in complete flux, right? Think of the slogan for Wikipedia, right? The free encyclopedia that anyone can edit, right? There remains much to be learned by investigating the encyclopedias of the past, as transformative as Wikipedia and Google, the new AI platforms that have stricken fear into the hearts of some professors, as sort of transformative they have been for our ability to retrieve information and to access knowledge. Those bound multi-volume encyclopedias that are now often relegated to our basements and attics can serve as really illuminating points of entry into the times in which they were produced. And perhaps unsurprisingly, the calm, quiet exteriors of most encyclopedias mask what was often a very turbulent process in the reference works productions. So I'll start showing some of the slides here. So when we look at and consider, maybe I'm doing this wrong. No. Nonsense, what's happening? Let's see. There we go. I got it. Great. Sorry. Yeah, I just have to give a look. So when we look at and consider encyclopedias of the past, we tend to presume the reliability and the consistency of the information. It's the uniformity of the volumes that reassures us, but also asserts the encyclopedia's authority. We imagine that there exists a central plan. These are just photos from my bookshelf, actually. A central plan and often a single editor who shepherds the project from its inception to its completion. Encyclopedias cover an established and defined body of knowledge, and they have a clear beginning and an end. And encyclopedias and other major reference works are themselves institutions, right? Think of the authority of the Britannica or the Oxford English Dictionary, for example. Now, by contrast, the Algemeyne Encyclopedia is at best defined, if by anything, by its incoherence, by its instability, and by its ever-changing mission. And this was on account of the rise of Nazism to power in Germany, its the continual displacement of Yiddish-speaking Jewish intellectuals, artists, and activists, and the shifting sands of Jewish diaspora nationalist politics, as well as changes in the symbolic and functional roles of Yiddish. So I'll walk you through this picture a little bit. So this is a complete set of the encyclopedia of first editions of the work, right? So if we go from right to left, on the very far right, you can see there's a really thin volume there. And that is the first of what were two Probeheften, so sample volumes, specimen volumes, that were created for subscribers, right? To sort of entice people to subscribe to this project. And what's fascinating about these, and I'll talk a little bit more about, and I'll show you some slides from it in a second, is that it's the only example that we have of what the encyclopedia would have looked like had it actually fulfilled the plan that was imagined at the time when the project began. These volumes are actually really quite hard to find. This first edition from 1932 from Berlin, I was able to get on loan more than once, from Ben Gurion University in Israel, that there's so few copies. The only other copy that I found available, I think, is in Cincinnati, and they wouldn't loan it to me, but Ben Gurion did. And then if you look, if you can see at the top, you'll see it says, numbers 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, right? And those are volumes that fall in the general category of information, right? So the name of the encyclopedia is the Algemeyne Encyclopedia, meaning the general encyclopedia, or as it was later translated, the universal encyclopedia. And you can see it just has this basic numbering system, and these first 5 volumes are mostly in the letter Aleph, and they make their way a little bit into the letter Beis. And then if you look at the next 7 volumes, you can see that these they have the word Yidden at the bottom of them, and then these go Aleph, Beis, Gimel, Dalet, Hey, Vav, Zayin. So they go through the Hebrew alphabet, and those are on the topic of Yidden, on Jews. And then you'll see there's actually a 4-volume set called The Jewish People Past and Present that was published in post-war America. Now, looking at this sort of mess of encyclopedias, there's very few lines of continuity. And really what we only have are those gold bars that are at the very top and at the base of the spines, which unite them. The one cover that's sort of in the middle, that's in its original slipcase, has a very interesting story, which I'll make sure to tell you. The first several of these volumes, the first 7 of them, were published in Paris over the course of the 1930s, and actually very early into the 1940s. And then the rest were published in New York, with the exception of that Probeheft, which is published in Berlin. So I'd like to what I'm going to do today is try to give you this larger history, because I think it really reveals a lot about like the fate of Yiddish in this period. And this book, this encyclopedia in many ways, really is the last collaborative efforts of a generation of Jewish intellectuals, activists, writers, who came of age actually in the 1905 Russian Revolution. And in many ways, it's an extension of my first book, which was a project of my dissertation, The Revolutionary Roots of Yiddish. And in this book, I sought to identify this first generation of Yiddish scholarly activists who had been born in the Russian Empire around 1880 or so, and who grew up in an age of increasing modernization in Russia, but also at a time of really heightened anti-Semitism. And for many of the founders of Yiddish intellectual culture, they had turned towards revolutionary activism in their youths, and they joined up with populist movements, nihilist movements, anarchists, socialists, communists. They were deeply committed to protecting the working class, but they also combined these ideologies with a deep nationalist sentiment. And for many of the first Yiddishists, this meant charting a path so that they could live as Jews in the lands in which they found themselves, while rejecting both the religious and assimilationist choices of prior generations. It also meant identifying an ideological course between Zionists who advocated building a Jewish state outside of Europe, but also those Jews on the far left, who were mostly Bolsheviks, who would not acknowledge the national rights of Jews. These activists were overly invested in the Russian Revolution of 1905, in a period in which, in the initial violence, 1 out of every 3 people arrested were Jews. And with that revolution's failure in 1907, political avenues for so many of these activists were cut off, and they began turning towards Yiddish cultural development. And in the process of this, they helped to elevate the status of Yiddish from what had widely been considered a jargon to a national language. And they dedicated the rest of their lives to its cultivation, linguistically, artistically, bibliographically. And what they did, they infused the language to a large extent with an ideology of Jewish self-determination and self-emancipation. And they helped to lay the groundwork for an intellectual and institutional basis for a Yiddish high culture. It included educational systems, research institutions, a Yiddish press, theater, later radio and film. And many within this generation also became among the leading political, cultural, and labor leaders of Eastern European Jewry, numbering in the millions for the first 4 decades of the 20th century. Now, for my encyclopedists, they found themselves in Berlin in the 1920s. They were in exile from the Soviet Union. They were sworn enemies of Bolshevism. And there was a period of time in the 1920s when Berlin, Germany became a really important center for the development of Yiddish and also Hebrew literature. Many of these figures were still on the political left, and they aligned themselves with social democratic movements, labor Zionists, different diasporist movements, and also the Mensheviks, who had been on the outs of the Communist Party. And so it was in this context of being in Berlin, away from the large centers of where Yiddish production was happening, where they reached this decision that as one of the sort of the crowning achievements of their work, they wanted to publish an encyclopedia, which had been the fulfillment of a long-held dream of many of these activists who had made various attempts at creating encyclopedias really for decades. And they saw that an encyclopedia in many ways is going to the pinnacle of their diaspora nation's accomplishments. And they really sought to differentiate their encyclopedia project from many other Jewish encyclopedias that were being created at the time. And I've given you sort of a slide here showing 3 of the major ones: the Jewish encyclopedia that came out in New York, which was one of the first slides I shown you, the Russian language encyclopedia and German language encyclopedias. And what unites all of these projects that were underway at this time period is that they were intentionally Jewish encyclopedias written in non-Jewish languages, right? And so they were designed to contain Jewish knowledge. They represent some of the best, historical research. It contains works on Jewish philosophy, Jewish literature, all aspects of Jewish culture. Had long essays on Jewish ideological movements, some of the first full discussions on this new phenomenon that was identified as anti-Semitism. And for these encyclopedists, though, who began imagining a Jewish encyclopedia, they wanted to do something that was really completely different. And so they worked quite against these encyclopedias. So instead of producing a Jewish encyclopedia in a non-Jewish language, they wanted to produce an encyclopedia of general knowledge in a Jewish language. And in so doing, they really were reaching out to a different set of potential readers altogether. If these previous encyclopedic attempts were very much about serving kind of twin goals of on the one hand, trying to bring Jewish knowledge to Jewish readers who maybe had assimilated and had kind of lost a connection to traditional sources, and at the same time to kind of reframe a Judaism so that it seemed compatible with these different, English-speaking, Russian-speaking, and German-speaking societies. What the Yiddish encyclopedia said, what Yiddish-speaking Jews need is entirely different. Right? Like, if they know Yiddish, they're close enough to the sources. They already know what it means to be Jewish. We don't need to teach them what it means to be Jewish. Instead, we want to create a non-Jewish encyclopedia, of general knowledge for the millions of Yiddish readers. They estimated 9 to 10 million Yiddish readers at the time who needed access to information about the larger world. Like, what they needed was a way to bring the knowledge of the world to Yiddish readers so they could participate in that world, so that they could be full members of that society. And they really saw that, every great nation has its encyclopedia, and this was the project that they were going to create. They also saw that this encyclopedia was a way to honor their teacher's 70th birthday, Simon Dubnov. And this may be a name who's familiar to some of you here. Simon Dubnov was a major Russian Jewish historian who was living in Berlin at the time. And by 1930, he had really achieved this status as being one of the most important historians in the Jewish world. He was in many ways the first major Jewish historian to take Eastern European Jews seriously as a topic of research. And he wasn't focused on what other previous historians had contended with on the spiritual aspects of Judaism, on the religious aspects. He really focused on the material aspects. He did what we would think of as modern historical research in many ways. He looked at archives, he looked at meeting records, he looked at business accounts. He really sought to create an understanding of the Jewish people that was in line with contemporary historical scholarship.
What was the name again?
Dubnov. Dubnov, yeah. Yeah. And for Dubnov, he had become in many ways really the ideological leader of the diaspora nationalist ideology, this belief that Jews had the right and indeed the obligation to make a home where they found themselves, but not assimilate into the larger culture, but to really sort of assert their right to live as Jews in the lands in which they resided. And for Dubnov, he had come up with this notion of shifting centers of modern Jewry, of historical Jewry. And he had looked at, the fact that Jews had centers that had moved from, Jerusalem to Babylonia, to Spain, to Germany, to Russia. And at this moment in his life, he was looking at the possibilities of new communities that would going to take over dominance in the world in America and potentially in then Palestine, the land of Israel. And for Dubnov, he had gathered around him a whole host of Yiddish intellectuals, many of whom did not share his political ideology, which is sort of liberal, anti-socialist in some ways, but they all sort of looked to him as this figure who held this authority to really kind of define Eastern European Jewry as a legitimate topic of study. And so a group of Yiddishists gathered around him. And so I've just given you a few of the figures here. You can see on the left, for example, Yakov Leszczynski, who was really the first major Jewish demographer and who wrote very important works, first charting the decline of Jewish life in the Städtlach of Eastern Europe. And it's also from him after the war that he's the first one who does the counting that gives us the number 6 million that we use. So Avram Rosen, who went under the pen name Ben Adir, who's a major Jewish figure in the Jewish territorialist movement, which argued for the creation of a Jewish homeland. And perhaps the figure who is most important in creating the Encyclopedia was Raphael Abramovich, who I think is largely forgotten in the Jewish world, but perhaps was one of the most well-known Jews in the first half of the 20th century. For he was the leader of the Menshevik party in exile. And so he was known throughout social democratic circles. He regularly traveled to the United States and around Europe and was really a sworn enemy of Lenin and Stalin and hoped very much to facilitate a transformation within the Soviet Union to bring Menshevism to the fold. But they all had to work for a living, all these figures. And so they worked as journalists and they worked as teachers and they worked as writers. And so in many ways, the creation of this encyclopedia was going to be another project by which they had sort of hoped to make a living. Also, so it had these practical implications to it. So in order to commemorate Dubnov's birthday, a group of figures decide they're going to create this encyclopedia. And there's about 24 of them in Berlin at the time working on this. And it's an exclusively male project at this time period. And this is one of the struggles for me in terms of writing this text. At lunch today, we were talking about, look, how do we find absences within archives? And this what's clear to me from having researched this work is that so many of the typists and the copy editors and the people doing a lot of clerical work were obviously women in this project, and their names are absent in the work. And so, I can talk maybe during the questions and answers some of the strategies that I had to contend with to try to sort this out. But I'll say that when this encyclopedia was sort of first being discussed, it almost immediately sparked controversy in the world of Yiddish letters, because the real question was like, what sort of encyclopedia did Jews need? Did they need a general or a Jewish encyclopedia? Did they need a popular and academic encyclopedia? And finally, it was decided that there would be a compromise. Sometimes it's talked as a 70-30 split, sometimes it's an 80-20 split, but that the bulk of information would be on general knowledge. And then particularly Jewish topics would be largely relegated to a supplement that would be under the title Yidden, that would be given as sort of a bonus to people who subscribed, right? So the original vision was 10 volumes plus this 11th volume on the topic of Jews. And it would be largely told from a secular, diasporous, pro-labor point of view. So 2 years after Dubnov's birthday, where there's a big celebration for this, they released the first of what becomes 2 different sample volumes, these Probeheften that I mentioned. And for those of you who can read Yiddish or Hebrew, you can see at the bottom, it says Dubnov Fund on the right, Berlin, 1932, and then another 1933. So they create this Probeheft, and in it, we have, it's about 50 pages or so, and it covers the entire Yiddish alphabet. And here I just have a few pictures from it that you can see, the types of the entries that were present. So there's an entry on obelisk, another on dinosaur, which I love. Right, sort of imagines the brontosaurus bigger than a steam train. Right? This next slide is probably my favorite one. Easter Island or Pesach Insel, Passover Island, right? And it's like this was the kind of information that's here. And fascinatingly, this Probeheft was so popular, generated its own reviews in the Yiddish press, as if it was already a publication. And because there was so much discussion around the Probeheft, they released a second one. And if I'll just go back a couple of slides here. Oops, sorry, too far. You see Berlin 1930. So it's released in early January 1933. And of course, at the end of that month, Hitler comes to power. And these are Jews, they are foreigners, and they are decidedly leftist. So they have this triple sort of mark on their backs. And they have to flee really quite quickly. Abramovich is able to escape because someone tips him off. Lischinski actually is arrested and held by the Gestapo for 2 weeks, and it's only pressure from the US State Department that actually allows for his release. But they ultimately make it to Paris, and they're able, after a lot of work, to reconstitute the encyclopedia. They reestablish the Dubnov Fund, which is kind of the funding arm for this work. It's at this time that negotiations with YIVO, the Yiddish Scientific Institute in Vilna, which had supported it, the project decides that it can't fund this project anymore, so they have to find their own funding. Many of their members had scattered to different parts of the world. Dubnov goes, eastwards, ultimately ends up in Riga. Others go to London, some go to America in this time period. But after a lot of work, so by the very end of 1934, December 28th of 1924, they released the first volume, the Erster Band of the Encyclopedia, from Aleph to Atlantic City. And in between these two entries are a really wide range of topics that are represented. It opens with a famous portrait of Jeremiah by the Jewish artist Lesser Uri. And it contains really a wealth of images that are in color and in black and white. And it carries a wide range of topics. And once the encyclopedia comes out, it's really hailed. This first volume comes out, it's hailed as an enormous achievement in the Jewish world. It too generates its own reviews in the press. The journal Literarische Blätter, for example, which I like to think of as like the New Yorker of its time in some ways, dedicates an entire issue over to the encyclopedia. Really, it's just this massive sort of coup for the encyclopedia, where they talk about, right? They says, you can see in the headline here, a Yiddish encyclopedia, like a fact, like it's now a thing that exists in the world. Right? It's this great triumph. It was widely hailed in the press in Poland, the Yiddish press in America, some in South America. It was criticized a bit in the Hebrew press, mostly for being in Yiddish. It was also criticized in the Soviet Yiddish press. And you can see here, just the title alone says that it's a bourgeois, clerical, nationalist encyclopedia under the mask of secularism, nonpartisanship, and social fair-mindedness, right? So it does have some opponents in the world. And the production of this encyclopedia is very slow. They're only able to put out one volume a year for the next several years. They were hoping to have 4 volumes a year, and then they decided, 2 volumes a year. They're really only able to eke out 1 volume a year. There's no funds for this project. They're not able to generate the subscribers that they had hoped. The encyclopedia is actually quite expensive, although it's sort of aimed at kind of a working class, intelligent audience.
That's what my father complained about.
Yeah, yeah. I mean, it was the average of, they priced it so it'd be the average of $5 per volume, and a set of 10 would be $50, which is quite a bit of money for the time period. So they're looking to fundraise. There's constant letters back to America. They sort of assume that it's American audiences that are going to put up the money for this. They don't. They're competing with YIVO, with the Polish secular school system, all of which are going at the sort of the same sources trying to raise funds. But they're able to put out these volumes, which I think is really quite remarkable. In 1935, 1936, 1937, they're able to put out 1 per year. But an interesting thing happens in the 3rd volume in 1936. At the very end of that volume, in the right place alphabetically, but out of place otherwise entirely, is a long essay on the topic of anti-Semitism. So this is a picture that talks about the expulsion of Jews from Frankfurt in the year 1614. It's reprinted from the Encyclopedia Judaica. And that really struck me as curious when I was first referencing. It's like, why is there this long multi-volume or multi-authored essay in what's otherwise an encyclopedia? And that was the first hint to me that like something's afoot in the project. And then in 1937, the same thing happens, where it's a sort of normal volume, all sorts of entries, Unter Wasserschiff and things like this. And it ends with a long entry on Eretz Yisrael, land of Israel / Palestine. And this too is a multi-page, multi-authored essay on the long history of the relationship between Jews and the land of Israel, ending with a fairly sympathetic view towards Zionism, which is quite fascinating for a group of people who did not identify as Zionists for much of their project. And of course, over the 1930s, the situation for Jews in Europe is declining sort of everywhere, right? Hitler's now been in power for 3 to 4 years at this point. Sort of the bar on anti-Semitism is lowered everywhere where Jews are found. And we see that this is beginning to shape the direction of the project. And then an interesting thing happens in 1938. So we know that 1938 is just a terrible year, right? It's the Anschluss, the German capture of Austria, where we have the first really mass violence against Jews, and the news, is spread worldwide. We have the Sudan crisis, where the taking of the sort of the outer section of the Czech portion of Czechoslovakia, and of course the November pogroms, right? Also, even perhaps more intimately, it's in 1938 that Mark Abramovich, who's the son of Raphael Abramovich, had gone off to fight in the Spanish Civil War and had been captured and been kidnapped by Stalinist agents in 1938. And Abramovich himself, who had really been the chief instigator of this project, goes to Spain to look for his son, cannot find him, later learn that he's murdered. And it's really thought that the son was captured to lure the father so that he could be brought back to Moscow to stand trial. So nothing gets published for the Encyclopedia in 1938, but there's sort of lots of efforts put forward towards selling the volume, and they're even thinking about publishing a French version of this. So I found in Cape Town, actually, these advertising documents for the Encyclopedia that they had at least done laid the groundwork for a French edition of the Encyclopedia. This never materializes, however. But in 1939, in response to the worsening crisis, the Encyclopedia announced they're going to release the supplement, that supplement Yidden, right? So they've got 4 volumes now done of the general. They say, because of the worsening situation, we're going to create the first of the Yidden volumes. And you can see here, actually, there will be 2 of them that get created in Paris. And they say that, what we want to create is a statistical handbook of Eastern European Jewry. It's in its orientation, it's very diaspora nationalist. This comes out in the spring of 1939. And it's really amazing essays on Jewish anthropology, archaeology, historiography, statistics, demography, economics, immigration, colonization, self-help. Has contributions by many of the leading lights of Yiddish letters, Aaron Steinberg, Elio Cherikover, Yoschinsky, Mark Vishnitzer. And like I said, it's published in 1939. And what they announced, though, is that we're not going to do just 1 Yidden volume, but it's so big, we're actually going to publish 2 of these. So they published the first in the spring of 1939. And of course, a few months later in September, World War II begins. And so they're in Paris, their main audience is in Poland, and so they're cut off from them, right? Poland is, of course, divided into 2. It's split between Germany and the Soviet Union. So they can't send their work, to Poland any longer, but they decide to continue with the Encyclopedia. So in April of 1940, they publish Yidden Base, the second of what was going to be just the short-term supplement of the Encyclopedia. It too is an amazing volume. It has these essays on Jewish languages, Hebrew, Aramaic, Yiddish, what they call other Jewish languages, on Jewish religion, on mysticism, literature, theater, art, music. It contained works by figures like Zelig Kalmanovich, Mach Weinreich, who's the head of YIVO, Avram Menes. Gershom Scholem contributes 2 essays on Jewish mysticism to this work. The great Hebreus Shimon Ravidovich, the historian Yankov Shotsky. It contains really an amazing work, a survey of Jewish art by Rachel Vishnitzer Bernstein. And I put this up image because this essay, which became her book, has just recently come out in English from Poland, just in the last year. And it's a little hard to get, but it's a phenomenal volume. Her work contains this richly illustrated 4-part essay on Jewish art that spans from the ancient period of Israelite settlement through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, the Baroque period, and beyond. So this work is sent to America because that's the audience. It's published, as I said, in 1940, and it's lost at sea. And it's thought that the ship was sunk by a U-boat. I never found confirmation of this, but this is what gets written about in the letters. A few volumes of this work, however, are sent by mail through London to New York, and those volumes still survive. And on that first photo that I showed you, there was that one book in binding, that I was able to find for $5 in a Jewish bookstore in New York many years ago when I was first working on this project. There's very few volumes of that have survived. So of course, in just a month or so after Yiddenbase is published, Germany invades Western Europe. And so these figures have to flee again, right? So they've already fled once from the Soviet Union to Berlin, now Berlin to Paris, and now they have to flee Paris ahead of the Nazis. And so they make their way to the south of France, to Marseille, through Toulouse, over the Pyrenees, through Spain to Lisbon. And they're able to get to the United States, many of them, not all of them, but many of the core group are able to make their way. So they arrive in very late summer of 1940. And they do so largely because of the various visits that Abramovich had made in the 1920s and 30s working with the Jewish labor movement. So he's able to get help from the Jewish Labor Committee and other groups, to get special visas from the State Department. I found in the files, letters of support on their behalf, like from figures like Thomas Mann, Frieda Kirschwey, who are all sort of testifying on their behalf. And so they come to America, and they're in a whole new climate. And almost immediately, they're able to republish that volume that got lost at sea. They team up with the Central Yiddish Cultural Organization, the CICO, which is still around today, which agrees to sort of take responsibility for the encyclopedia. They reestablish ties with Vivo, whose founder, Max Weinreich, had also made it to America. And they make a commitment to continue this encyclopedia and to sort of keep going with this project. And of course, in America, there's a whole new set of challenges that they have. Once again, they have to rebuild the project almost from scratch. They write in the letters how they took with them only the manuscripts that they had. They had to leave everything else behind. Their index cards that they had created of every topic that they would possibly write on. The printing plates, the stacks of paper that they had purchased, all the unsold issues of the encyclopedias, thousands of them. They had to leave everything behind. It's literally what they could carry. They carried manuscripts with them, and they just enough so that they could continue with the project. But again, in a new milieu, they have to find new staff members. They have to find housing. They also have to find jobs for themselves. They have to support their families. They have to continue. And this is at a time period, over the first half of the 1940s, where they're in America, and they're beginning to watch and beginning to understand what's happening to the communities that they've left behind, and over which they had sort of assumed an enormous sense of responsibility. They were they saw themselves as the caretakers of Eastern European Jewish culture, of Yiddish culture, and now from America, they're watching its destruction. So it's in this time period of mourning that they make this commitment that we're going to continue with this project. Figures like Dubnov, Kalmanovich, Leon Bramson, all of them had passed away. They make the decision that they're going to continue publishing, and they publish what becomes Yidden Gimel, which is the third, and what they say is the last of the series on Jews. So the end of the supplement, and they're going to restart the project. This volume, Yidden Gimel, comes out in, I think it's 1944 from New York. It too is this amazing work, but they also make the decision to not include any essays from comrades whose fate was unknown. So they sort of held off on publishing these works. And by the end of the war, they recognize that the mission of the encyclopedia now needs to change sort of utterly. Actually, in 1945, they release the last of the volumes, that fifth volume of general knowledge. And what they decide is that the encyclopedia needs to take on the responsibility of sort of continuing Yiddish culture. And that, what Jews in America, what Yiddish-speaking Jews need is not a general handbook of information of world knowledge. What they need is something else. So they set for themselves these 4 tasks that they decide is going to be the sort of the last work of their lives. They see themselves as responsible for salvaging the remnants of Yiddish culture from Europe, that they want to restore a network of transnational Yiddish speakers who are now scattered around the globe, as well as trying to build up Yiddish in America. In time, they see themselves having the responsibility of documenting the Churban, the Holocaust. And then finally, they take on this task of making Eastern European Jewish history serviceable to American Jewry. They recognize that Dubnovian model of shifting centers, so they've lived through one of these shifts, that European Jewry is not going to lead world Jewry any longer. That is now up to what they called the new Jewish community, which was celebrating its 300th anniversary at the time, but that the new Jewish community in North America really had this responsibility, that they had to create a legacy for those American Jews to carry really and kind of distill Eastern European Jewish history and culture down to the essentials. And what this does is it forces them to relinquish many of their earlier commitments. First of all, the commitment to the Encyclopedia as being a site of general knowledge, but also that Yiddish-speaking Jews and Jews in America are they're not going to be concerned with the politics of diaspora nationalism so much anymore. They're not even concerned with the demands of socialism so much anymore. And so what we see is that the encyclopedia becomes less of an encyclopedia in many ways and more of a miscellany that brings together a wide range of scholars, many of whom who really wanted nothing to do with it in its earlier forms. As I said, they released Yidin Gimel and Daled volumes. These get published in 1942, 1950. And finally, they come to the conclusion that they also need to begin publishing this work for non-Yiddish readers, right? And so it's even during the war years that they publish what becomes the Jewish People Past and Present. Initially, they think of this as 1 volume, and then this is a reprint here. But ultimately, it becomes 4 volumes. And what these works do is they contain really some of the best writing from the Yiddish volumes, some of them translated, some of them really sort of updated, as well as new writings that they're able to commission for this work. But they don't stop with the Yiddish. Just because they put out the English doesn't stop them from putting out the Yiddish. And they put out a volume in 1950 on Jewish life in the Americas that begins with a really large sort of sweeping history of Jews in America by the historian Anita Lebison, who locates Jews really from the beginnings of Columbus, to the present. And it tries to be a pretty sweeping overview of Jewish life in the Americas. And it's all about trying to bring this community of Yiddish speakers who are in the Americas at the time, bring them together and sort of place them into one community with one another. There's a fairly long passage on Yiddish in Canada, or Jews in Canada, by Louis Rosenberg, who's the social statistician, the author of the 1939 study Canada's Jews. He had written a piece on the Jewish community, and he was a labor Zionist who had spent his childhood in Leeds and emigrated to Canada just prior to World War I. This essay examines Jewish birth and death rates, marriage rates, employment politics, and it locates the Jewish presence deep within Canada's history, dating back to the mid-18th century. And for Rosenberg, the piece deals with, in many ways, details the Jewish contribution to Canada and asserts the rights of Jews to exist as a minority within this multinational, multilingual country. There's other essays on Jewish life in Latin America, Argentina, Brazil, Mexico, Cuba, all get entries. And it's at this time that they begin rethinking the encyclopedia once again. It goes through yet another shift. There's a decision that's made in the 1950s to actually restart the Aleph base versions, but that never gets completed because the person who they hired for it, the Hebraeus Shimon Ravidovich, has a heart attack and passes away. And then finally, the last two volumes of the encyclopedia, which come out in 1964 and 1966, are histories of the Holocaust. And these volumes are very slow to get together. They're plagued by the loss of many of the original members, the fact that they're trying to begin this new initiative. It's led by Philip Friedman, who's really the first major historian of the Holocaust, who passes away while editing this work in 1960. And by this time, most of the original initiators of the project had either passed away or were told they could no longer be involved with it. The Nadir, Cherikover, others like Shmuel Charny, Philip Friedman, had all passed away. Abramovich himself is blind by 1960 and is only dedicating his life to writing his memoirs and actually pretty major work on the formation of the Soviet Union. There's also, of course, very few buyers for this project, and yet it's still really an amazing resource. It was a really surprise to me that Raoul Hilberg lended his editorial assistance to us, who's considered, in many ways, one of the first authors of a comprehensive history of this work. And in these two volumes, what we have in many ways is the first sort of edited overview of the Holocaust. It contains 28 essays by 22 authors. These volumes were published in part with funding from the Claims Conference, the reparations money by Germany. And it contains one of the most comprehensive studies of the Holocaust from the point of view of its Jewish victims. And it stands, the work itself stands as a powerful repudiation to those studies that focus solely on the perpetrators of the genocide, and to those historians who dismiss Jewish sources in their research, and to those writers who condemn Jewish victims for not resisting forcefully enough. The volumes contain articles on nearly every aspect of occupied Europe and draw their material from sources from more than a dozen languages. Most of the essays are organized by country, and they're particularly infused with discussions of the Jewish experience within the Holocaust. And there's particular attention paid to the question of Jewish resistance. It includes this map, the network of resistance that highlights the many labor camps, concentration camps, and extermination centers where Jews took up arms against their oppressors. And in fact, the issue of Jewish resistance is prominent throughout the volume, from the opening essay by Avram Menes to lengthy discussions of the 1943 armed uprising in the Warsaw Ghetto and other sites of Poland, also with many photos of Jewish partisans. And I'll tell you that as a way to sort of conclude this history, when I began researching this project, I was in New York. I was at YIVO in 2008. And the TSICO, which had taken responsibility over for publishing the project in 1940, is still around, right? It had offices just above Union Square in New York. And so I remember calling over there and speaking to Wolfe, who's the director of the TSICO then and now. And I asked him, I said, I'm looking for sources on the encyclopedia. And he says to me, it's really, I still remember this conversation really clear. It's like, you're calling about the Yiddish encyclopedia? Like, never in all my years has anyone ever called about the encyclopedia. He says, come on over, my basement's full of them. And so I walked over from YIVO, and he took me down to the basement of what was then the Atran building, where there was old offices still of the Bund who were there and other Yiddish organizations. And floor to ceiling were these last volumes on the Holocaust, just stacked in these perfectly neat, orderly rows. They had published 1,500 each of these, and most of them were still there in the basement of the work. And it was really this profound sort of shock for me in many ways, see that all of this labor had gone into these works that had largely been unwritten. They never had found the money to publish what they had hoped for would be an English translation. And most of these works still are just not known and not read. So as I hope I've conveyed in this overview, the Algemeyne Encyclopedia is much more than a disjointed collection of obsolete information. And that its volumes contain snapshots of how so many of the leading Jewish intellectuals of the 20th century interpreted the Jewish past, present, and future, in what were some of the most tumultuous decades in all of Jewish history. And so with that, thank you.